Okay, welcome everyone to the presentation. We really do have such a great lineup for you tonight. We have my research presentation about the Invisible Man and the cultural themes of the Harlem Renaissance. So, we have the Harlem Renaissance. It was a great time period during the 1920s and 30s in New York, specifically Harlem, which, given the name, makes a whole bunch of sense. So the Harlem Renaissance was a time where the African American community was rediscovering its culture in ways of music, writing, and just other creative forms. So, a famous poet during the time was Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was one of probably the most popular poet, if not like almost of all time. Everybody's heard of Langston Hughes. A specific piece he made that I want to focus on is Let America Be America Again. He speaks of the American dream and how that the American dream is only achievable for some, but that it's not in their control, that like the American dream isn't accessible to everyone. This in itself defines the time period of segregation, like even though it's supposed to be this time of great like cultural revolution, everything's happening, right? But there's still very many things that happen with the segregation and racial relations during the time period. Another person who brings this up is Zora Neale Hurston. That's a mouthful. She is also a writer and poet during the time. She made her piece How It Feels to Be Colored Me. This was a whole book. It's about like how she felt during the time period, but she had a very interesting point of view for most people during the time. She would see these things of discrimination, and though it was happening, it wouldn't like necessarily get to her in her head so much to say, but she wouldn't exactly like shrug it off as if like nothing was happening. Obviously, there was a big problem, but there are many more things that are happening that she just doesn't let it get to her. Like, she's like, yeah, you're going to discriminate me because I'm an African American female. I mean, whatever. I can't do anything about that, but it's wrong and we need to change. Okay, another point I would like to point out is that the book Invisible Man also references like these different like segregation and racial conflicts. The book Invisible Man, at the beginning he's at his college, which is references to the Tuskegee Institute or the Tuskegee University. Um he on Founders Day he drives around a white man by the name of Mr. Norton. While Mr. Norton, he encounters just a whole bunch of racial profiling and segregation with Jim Trueblood, who is like signified to act as like a slave or a sharecropper during the time because slavery was illegal, but it was still technically happening under the term sharecropping. But this is mentioned in Invisible Man by the just racial gap whenever he was driving Mr. Norton around. And it's very clear that it's happening with the way that the other African American communities are treating like Mr. Norton versus how Mr. Norton sees himself as like some sort of savior of the black race, which is really interesting because during the time period of the Cultural Revolution that was the Harlem Renaissance, I mean, it was not exactly uncommon for this racial segregation, but like very many things were happening to make sure that things like that weren't happening anymore so that it would be more just level, more like equality for the different races, which relates itself back to the How It Feels to Be Colored Me because of the different point of view taken by Hurston. It basically creates a sense of, oh, my segregation attacks aren't working anymore, so it might be a way that it was used to like drive down racial profiling and segregation just by just simply ignoring it during the time, which was amazing by many people who had this point of view during the time. Okay, now I'm sure the Cultural Revolution of the Harlem Renaissance had so much importance, but the most important part of the Harlem Renaissance was religion. I say that very clearly. Religion. People loved going to the church. They loved church, praying, psalms, hymns, everything. The church was one of the greatest places to be at. So here we have James Weldon Johnson, and he wrote his the book which had the creation in it, which is a poem about the creation of the world that we have in Genesis of the Bible. His poem basically goes in depth about how God was lonely and he created man in his image to roam the earth. But this this alone has very many cultural like implications towards the time period to have a writer such as James Weldon Johnson who had like a lot of publications during the time period. So the Harlem Renaissance was a huge cultural revolution. That's not just music, writing. Religion is the biggest part by far, which is shown by James Weldon Johnson's The Creation. And that is the majority of the Harlem Renaissance. Essentially, the Cultural Revolution in New York was one of the greatest times to be alive. We see this in the book Invisible Man. He's moved to New York in about pretty early in the book, and he finds this place and he makes it his own. And while there, he also encounters the church, the brotherhood, and he ultimately finds his place in the brotherhood. So the book and all of these primary sources prove that the cultural relevance of the Harlem Renaissance is one that is of great importance and should be studied more in our classrooms today.